By May of 1941, the Mediterranean had become a sapphire-blue graveyard for the ambitions of empires. The German war machine, fresh from its lightning conquest of the Balkans, stood at the water and Apos' edge, gazing toward the strategic prize of Crete. It was an island of myth and limestone, a natural aircraft carrier that could either protect the British lifeline to the Suez Canal or serve as a springboard for Hitler's designs on the oil fields of the Middle East. But the sea was a domain the Wehrmacht could not yet master, and so, the decision was made to conquer from the clouds. General Kurt Student, the visionary and father of the German paratroopers, proposed a gamble that had never been attempted in the history of human conflict. He envisioned a total vertical envelopment, an invasion conducted entirely by air, bypassing the Royal Navy's crushing superiority at sea. It was a plan born of supreme confidence, bordering on hubris, fueled by the rapid successes of the Fallschirmjäger in the Low Countries. Student believed his hunters from the sky were invincible, a belief that would soon be tested against the jagged rocks and the fierce inhabitants of Crete. The systemic failures of Operation Mercury began long before the first Junkers 52 took flight. German intelligence, the Abwehr, committed a series of catastrophic analytical errors that would haunt the operation from its inception. They estimated the Allied presence on the island to be no more than 5,000 demoralized troops, survivors of the retreat from Greece. In reality, the island was defended by over 40,000 soldiers, including battle-hardened New Zealanders, Australians, and British regulars, supported by thousands of Greek troops. But the irony of Crete lies in the fact that the British possessed the ultimate advantage. Through the ultra-intercepts at Bletchley Park, the Allied commander on the island, General Bernard Freyberg, knew almost everything. He knew the date of the invasion, the landing zones, and the strength of the incoming German forces. The trap was set, and the German elite were flying directly into a prepared slaughterhouse. Yet, the fog of war has a way of blinding even those who can see the future. On the morning of May 20, 1941, the silence over Crete was shattered by the rhythmic thrum of hundreds of transport planes. Thousands of silk parachutes blossomed in the sky, a spectacle of terrifying beauty. To the defenders below, it looked like a harvest of white flowers falling from the heavens. But for the Fallschirmjäger, the descent was a nightmare. German paratrooper doctrine of the time dictated that soldiers jump with only a pistol and a gravity knife, their primary weapons dropped separately in canisters. As they drifted slowly toward the earth, the paratroopers were utterly defenseless. The New Zealanders and Australians, positioned on the ridges overlooking the landing zones, opened a devastating fire. The sky was filled with the screams of men caught in their harnesses, shredded by machine gun fire before their boots ever touched the ground. Hundreds were killed in the air, their bodies dangling from olive trees or sinking into the Mediterranean. Those who survived the drop found themselves pinned down in vineyards, desperately crawling toward weapon canisters that were often guarded by Allied snipers. The tactical disaster was most acute at Maleme, a vital airfield on the western end of the island. The German assault there was led by the elite Storm Regiment, but they were decimated within hours. Their commander, General Meindl, was severely wounded, and the battalion structures collapsed into isolated pockets of desperate men. The Germans were failing. By the end of the first day, Kurt Student sat in his hotel room in Athens, contemplating suicide as reports of the massacre reached his desk. The grand experiment was a bloodbath, and the Allied victory seemed inevitable. However, history is often decided by the weight of a single decision. At Maleme, the New Zealand 22nd Battalion held the high ground known as Hill 107, which commanded the airfield. Despite the carnage inflicted on the Germans, the New Zealand commander, Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Andrew, became convinced his positions were being overrun due to a breakdown in communications. In the darkness of the first night, he made the fateful decision to withdraw his troops. It was a phantom retreat, a systemic failure of command that handed the Germans the only thing they needed to survive, a foothold. When the sun rose on the second day, the Germans were astonished to find Hill 107 abandoned. They seized the height and began landing mountainous piles of reinforcements and heavy equipment, even as the airfield remained under the sights of British artillery. The Junkers 52s flew into a maelstrom of fire, crashing on the runway and piling up in heaps of burning metal, but the sheer momentum of the German build-up began to turn the tide. The window for an Allied victory was closing, a victim of cautious leadership and the brutal persistence of the German mountain troops who were now being ferried in. While the professional armies clashed, an unsung and visceral force rose from the Cretan soil. The civilians of Crete, men, women, and children, did not wait for orders to defend their homes. Armed with ancient flintlock rifles, kitchen knives, and even farming scythes, they hunted the paratroopers in the hills. The Cretan resistance was a shock to the German system, which expected a population cowed by the might of the WWII. Instead, they found a populace that fought with a Homeric ferocity, mutilating the fallen and ambushing patrols with a ruthlessness that would later trigger horrific reprisals. The heroism of the Maori battalion also became legendary during these days. In the heat of the Mediterranean sun, they launched bayonet charges that froze the blood of the German mountain troops. The Maori war cries echoed through the olive groves, a primal sound that reminded the invaders that they were no longer in the civilized theater of Western Europe, but in a struggle for survival where no quarter was given. These men fought for every inch of the rugged terrain, often holding positions until they were completely surrounded and out of ammunition. By the fifth day, the systemic failures of the Allied command had become irreversible. Despite the Royal Navy's heroic efforts to prevent a seaborne invasion, which cost them several cruisers and destroyers to the relentless Luftwaffe dive bombers, the land battle was being lost. The Allied forces began a grueling retreat across the White Mountains toward the southern port of Sfakia. It was a march of agony, through narrow gorges and over sun-scorched peaks, with the German mountain troops nipping at their heels like wolves. The Royal Navy, battered and bleeding, returned to the southern coast to evacuate as many men as possible. Admiral Cunningham, when warned that the Navy would lose too many ships, famously replied that it takes 3 years to build a ship but 300 years to build a tradition. They would not leave the army behind. Thousands were rescued, but thousands more were left to the mercy of the advancing Germans, becoming prisoners of war in a land they had defended with such desperate valor. The fall of Crete was a victory for Germany, but it was a Pyrrhic one of the most haunting proportions. The Fallschirmjäger had been bled white. Over 6,000 of Germany's finest soldiers were dead or missing, a loss so profound that Hitler, shaken by the casualty lists, forbade any future large-scale airborne operations. He declared that the day of the paratrooper was over, believing that the element of surprise had been permanently lost to history. The very elite force that had opened the door to the conquest of Europe was effectively discarded as a strategic weapon. The historical irony is profound. While Hitler abandoned the airborne concept because of Crete, the Allies, impressed by the initial German audacity despite the losses, began to build their own massive airborne divisions. The lessons learned in the blood-soaked olive groves of Crete would eventually inform the drops over Normandy and the Rhine. The Fallschirmjäger had died so that the Allied paratroopers could one day fly. Crete remains a testament to the fact that wars are not won by intelligence or technology alone, but by the unpredictable friction of human will. It was a battle where the victors were too damaged to celebrate and the losers were haunted by what might have been. The silence that eventually returned to the island was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a graveyard. As the sun sets over the cemetery at Maleme, the rows of white crosses stand as a permanent reminder of General Student's gamble. The limestone of Crete absorbed the blood of thousands, a grim sacrifice to a tactical vision that was both ahead of its time and tragically flawed in its execution. The ghosts of the hunters from the sky and the defenders of the island remain intertwined in the dust, a final, tragic conclusion to the most daring and disastrous operation of the Second World War. In the grand tapestry of history, Crete is the moment where the sky fell and the earth rose up to meet it. It serves as a philosophical warning that even the most elite forces can be humbled by a lack of imagination in leadership and the sheer defiance of a people who refuse to be conquered. The island stands today, rugged and beautiful, a silent witness to the week when the gods of war looked down in horror at what men were capable of doing to one another in the name of victory. The shadow of the parachute has long faded, but the echoes of the struggle still linger in the mountain passes, a haunting melody of courage, failure, and the relentless march of time.